So this is the first podcast of the year 2026. Happy New Year to everybody, and especially our guest for today, which is Megan Gafford. She is an artist and a writer. She publishes visual essays at her Substack newsletter, Fashionably Late Takes. And today we're discussing an essay which she wrote that was published by Quillette late last year, titled "The Line Dividing Good and Evil," in regards to the two famous writers of the 20th century, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn and James Baldwin. Megan, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing well. How are you?
Yeah, likewise, keeping myself busy and everything. So tell me a little bit about your artistic and literary background.
More artistic than literary, however much the essay dealt with these literary figures. My background's in painting and drawing. I taught those subjects at various universities for about 10 years and was a practicing contemporary artist. And a couple years ago, I made a pivot to becoming a writer. And I always include my hand-drawn pencil drawings in the essays. And I hope it becomes more interesting than a typical banner image that you see with any essay that's usually forgettable and maybe an afterthought, and um, lends a kind of elevation to the writing to say that this is a topic that's not transient, it's perennial, it's something that is worth spending 12 to 20 hours making a drawing about before publishing. That this is something that I think is worth thinking about for a long time. So it helps me vet the subjects that I'm going to write about. And as I said, I hope it kind of elevates the ideas I'm trying to communicate to my readers if it gives it that sense of importance. And and also, I just love to draw, and I love being able to bring the drawings into the writing. I've always been a big comic book nerd, and to bring the visual art and the craft of writing together, to me, is just something I enjoy very much as a medium.
Certainly. Yeah. So, what topics or themes inspire you?
So I often write about aesthetics because that's my background. And so I often write about the history of contemporary art, of architecture, and also of literature, which of course is it's an aesthetic that often lives inside our heads, but it's an aesthetic all the same. And so, the essay that you reached out to me about is it's about these two writers, but it's something that applies to all kinds of art. The risk of art becoming propaganda is just as strong in the visual arts as it is in the literary arts. And I think that is something that artists need to take care to resist, because then you betray your purpose. There's already activists and politicians who are doing that work, and you could become one of those if you want. But I think we should have a distinct craft where artists ought to be more interested in the messiness of human nature rather than trying to um, uh, make a point that sometimes comes at the expense of truth, that comes at the expense of seeking the answer to questions wherever that's going to lead you, because often that kind of mindset gives you a predetermined answer rather than that sort of searching quality artists ought to have for discovering what the truth is, to actually not know the answer to a question when you ask it, instead of starting with the answer and then working your way backwards to justify it, which I think is what often happens with propaganda.
Okay. Yeah. So I'd like to dive deeper into that question that you pose. What separates art from propaganda? How can we tell the difference between the two?
So you'll certainly have even thinkers I admire, like George Orwell, claim that there really isn't a distinction, that anytime you're trying to make a point, it's the same thing, that to take the word propaganda literally, to propagate. I think that elides the central point, though. Excuse me. Um, there's a reason that uh, the idea of propagation is not totally synonymous with propaganda, that we understand that uh, propaganda has this goal of telling you what to think and trying to, again, in an activist kind of way, convince you to join a cause. And maybe the propaganda is correct, maybe it's not, but art should be something that is less definitive. It's something that is more exploratory. One of the beautiful things about art is even artwork that's existed for centuries, we can still argue about what it means. And part of the value of art is the joy of arguing about it. It's this intellectually rigorous and aesthetically rigorous process of discussing and wondering about what it means all over again. And unlike the sciences, you're never going to come to a concrete answer that everyone can agree upon. Unlike a political reality where you're trying to push a policy through and then have a success and move on to the next goal, you don't want to have something that's closed and shut in the arts, where you say, okay, we know what Shakespeare means now. Okay, we know what East of Eden means now. And we don't have to think about it anymore because we've answered this question and we can move on. So propaganda is more like that. It's more like, I have an answer. We're going to achieve this goal, and then we're going to try to move on to the next problem that we want to tackle. Whereas with art, it should never go away. We should never say, okay, we figured it out and we're done.
Okay. Right. So that leaves the question of whether an artwork that reflects the view of the author and or written in support of, say, a pet cause, let's say Uncle Tom's Cabin or To Kill a Mockingbird, when it comes to like slavery and racism. How would you categorize them, or do they count as art or propaganda?
I think Uncle Tom's Cabin counts more as propaganda. I obviously support the cause that it was fighting for to end slavery. That's a fantastic cause. So again, you can have propaganda that I agree with. Um, I enjoy To Kill a Mockingbird as a book much more. When I read that book, the characters did come to life to me more. So I could think more about that one. It's been a long time since I've read it, and I would want to reread it to give you my definitive take on where I land on that. But my memory from decades past is that I enjoyed reading that one. So, and I mentioned Orwell a minute ago. I love Orwell, but his books are allegories. They're not really literature properly, and um, I think that's part of why he came to the conclusion that he thought all art was propaganda, is that that's the kind of work he was making. Again, it was political opinions that I agree with. So I can enjoy it very much. And it's not to say that there isn't a place for that kind of work in the world. I like allegories too. But I don't think it's the same thing as, like I mentioned before, the sort of work that you continue puzzling over. We can know what Orwell meant a lot more definitively. It's something that's a little less up for interpretation than I mentioned East of Eden because it's my favorite novel, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately. And that's the kind of story that you keep returning to and thinking about. And it has some interesting moral themes. There's some interesting philosophical ideas, but it's not the kind of thing that's so easy to interpret that you don't have to keep puzzling over it for a long time. And so I think that I don't think of Orwell as an artist, however much I value him. And that's okay. There's different types of valuable things in the world, and he just wasn't an artist very much.
Okay. Well, without diving into, well, your personal politics, how do you, how should I put, draw a line somewhat between your
Pun
politics
intended.
and your artistic work so that those two do not overlap in ways that, cancel one another, I suppose?
So sometimes I do write about politics, and that means that there isn't a sharp dividing line. I'm not shy about talking about what I believe in, and actually one of the reasons I made a pivot away from contemporary art, visual art, the kind of art you'd show in a gallery or museum, and became more of a writer, is because I did want to talk about ideas more concretely. It's a big problem, I think, in the visual art world where we can go into this if you like, but there's this long history where being earnest is embarrassing in the contemporary arts. And people find ways to slip being earnest back in, often by making very political art, very propagandistic art. So there is this strong urge in the contemporary art world to tell people what to think about things, to make a political statement, and it creates work that's very shallow. That's not it doesn't really rise to the goal of being good art. Um, so I was not doing that, but I understood the temptation because I did have things that I wanted to say. And so part of my pivot to becoming a writer is, well, I don't want to compromise the values I hold about what visual art is supposed to be. If I have things to say, I want to use a proper medium for that. So I'm an essayist. I've never tried my hand at fiction. The artwork in my essays is literally the pencil drawings, and those, if you look at especially divorced from the text, they're not going to tell you what to think. And so I still get to enjoy that part of being an artist. But I think that the written word is very much, again, it's essays. It's not, I'm not trying to be an artist, even though I try to bring in a kind of aesthetic sensibility or elegance into the style of how I'm writing. But it's very much, nonfiction prose, and I am sharing ideas. So I wouldn't consider that art in the same way that I would expect from the best kind of art I want to see in a gallery or museum. And I want there to be this interplay between the drawings and the writing, like I mentioned. But as I said, I also hope that somebody could look at the drawing, and if they never read the essay, then they're not going to be told what to think, and they can enjoy that as artwork in of itself.
Okay. Yeah. So speaking about your artwork, let's talk about the piece that accompanies the essay, which is two men who looks like uh both look like Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn in a chess game. So
Mm-hmm.
tell me about the significance of it in regards to the piece itself, the written piece.
In the piece, as you mentioned, it was titled "The Line Dividing Good and Evil." Um, so first of all, Solzhenitsyn is someone who I admire very much, even though, as I write about, he takes this dark turn later in life. He embraces Putin, and I find it disappointing. But he still had these incredible contributions to humanity, like the Gulag Archipelago, who with this book, he essentially introduced what the Gulag was to the world. And that was an incredible contribution that could never be negated by his like later embrace of this authoritarian figure that stood against so much of what his earlier work was fighting against. So I see this tension in him of it's really summarized well by his own famous quotes where he says, "If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?" So I was trying to think of a way to visualize this very struggle in Solzhenitsyn's heart, and I was trying to symbolize that with the chess match. Uh, Chess seems appropriate because it very much has the Cold War vibes of like the U.S. and Soviet players competing against each other. Solzhenitsyn himself was not a big chess player, I have to admit. So it's something he had played chess casually, but he was not a big chess guy himself. Nevertheless, I thought symbolically it works really well. Again, both as capturing this sense of the Cold War era, and also because chess is itself warlike symbolically. Like all the pieces are like these medieval characters who are going to be battling each other. You have the Manichaean symbolism of the white and the black, the good versus the evil. And so what I did visually with that is you have a version of Solzhenitsyn where he's wearing a white shirt, who's got the white chess pieces, and then you have the version of him who's wearing a dark suit with the black chess pieces. And they're playing against each other. And behind them is a gradient from dark to light, which helps just create contrasts so that the dark part of the gradient's behind the lighter figure and vice versa, and they pop out, you see them better, just visually pleasing, but also there's some symbolism there too, where you again have the dark and light interplay, but unlike the chess pieces, it's a gradient. You get all the shades of gray, and it's not like a black and white graphic. It's a pencil drawing, and the whole thing is shades of gray, which is also about nuance. So I wanted to capture that there's this risk of a Manichaean worldview, but at the same time, the better way to look at the human heart is in all of its messy nuance, that you can have someone who makes these incredible contributions to humanity that he later betrays. And we can still admire this person for the contributions while appreciating his tragedy.
I see. Of course, we don't have, at least in the Quillette site, uh, an illustration in regards to James Baldwin, who's another writer that I admire very much. So if you were to provide an illustration for James Baldwin in regards to the contents of the written piece, how would you visualize it?
I considered doing a second chess thing with Baldwin, but I thought that would be a little redundant. Um, you're stumping me. I'd have to think about what's another good symbolic thing for Baldwin. It's a good question. I have to think about it. Because I satisfied myself with the one drawing, I didn't puzzle over that for too much longer.
Okay.
Um, so I'll just bring it up because I quoted that really wonderful Solzhenitsyn paragraph. There's this analogous thing that Baldwin says where he observes that nobody is more dangerous than he who imagines himself pure in hearts, whereas purity by definition is unassailable. So something, because I admire both of them very much and I appreciate these different versions of the same sentiment.
I would imagine that if there was a an illustration about Baldwin in relates to the piece, it would be a stumbling block. There would be a stumbling block of some kind that's featured because there was a metaphorical stumbling block that affected his writing, in your view.
Mm-hmm.
What, how would you elaborate on that? What was the block that that Baldwin stumbled?
Well, Baldwin sacrificed quite a bit for the civil rights movement and just suffered under Jim Crow very much. So it's hard to be too harsh on him. He, you know, I feel a lot of compassion for what he went through, and I can understand and appreciate why that made him feel very hateful towards white Americans and America in general as a hypocrisy, as betraying our founding ideals. And so he was a very angry young man, and he left America and spent a long time as an expat in Paris, where there, with a lot of both physical and emotional distance from Jim Crow America, he would encounter other Americans and realize suddenly that he had so much more in common with them, even if it was like a white GI from Texas, he says, than any European that he meets. So getting that emotional distance and that physical distance helped him let go of a lot of that bitterness and hatred. And he warmed up to America. He produced his best literary art in this period. But then he came back and he joined the civil rights movement, where he wasn't just dealing with trying to solve the problem of Jim Crow, but also within the civil rights movement himself. He was sidelined for being gay. So he was mistreated kind of on all sides. And the bitterness set back in. By the end of his life, I have to double check. I think he died in the 80s. He lived through and he caused so much of this incredible transformation in American society, where America in the 1980s, certainly still not perfect, but worlds better than Jim Crow America. But he still hated the word progress, and he didn't like the idea that we should, be too pleased with ourselves over progress, and didn't appreciate his own accomplishments in that sense. And so I think for him, the stumbling block was when he was far away from America, it was easier for him to let go of his anger and to see the goodness and the potential of America that was there despite all of the atrocities. But when he came back and he's suffering all over again, he's being mistreated even by his allies. I think it was just such a large burden that that was a stumbling block. It was too close, too painful. It was too harsh. And again, it's hard for me to, I can't judge him harshly. And I still admire him so much, but I think it was still wrong. It's objectively true that America in the 80s was um, a more moral place than it was under Jim Crow. And so that's not to say that it's guaranteed that that kind of progress always continues, and it's correct to remain vigilant. But I don't think the bitterness helped him in his cause. And it creates a kind of mixed legacy where nowadays you're going to have people all over the American political spectrum picking out a piece of James Baldwin from different parts of the chronological timeline of his life to justify whatever they believe in. So he's kind of become an easy figure because so many of us admire him. He was so eloquent. He's so easy to admire. And we can all find a piece of him to justify whatever we want to believe. He's kind of become a piece of propaganda as a historical figure in that sense, where like I can pick out the part of James Baldwin that I really appreciate, the part where he's in Paris, and use that to justify my ideas about America. And someone else can find one at the end of his life and say, America is still terrible. Look at this. And we're both correctly quoting the same man. So we have to be careful not to turn people into propaganda too, to appreciate that we can't just appeal to the authority of a quotation. We have to understand the totality of their life experience, where they were at in these different points of their lives, to really represent them as a whole person, to not just make them this symbol. And I think that does more justice to them as people. So there's an interesting irony there that he started writing protest novels at the end of his life, even though he decried the protest novel early on. And for all the same reasons he hated protest novels, that they had nothing but these one-dimensional symbolic characters. People now use him as a one-dimensional symbolic character very often.
Yeah, that's very well put. Um, I like some of his nonfiction essays, and I certainly appreciate his novels like Giovanni's Room. One of the texts that I read from him while in the heights of the was it Israel-Gaza conflict was his sort of piece explaining why Black Americans do not get along with Jewish Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And his version is that they basically believe that Jewish people are, well, they either are white or are more favored in white society than Black Americans, and therefore they get all of the advancements that Black Americans do not typically tend to have. Now, so you've made a good case in explaining how Baldwin seems to harden his heart towards the end of his life. So how would you make the same case when it comes to Solzhenitsyn?
So I would say that I think their transformations were different. Maybe this would be a better question for a Solzhenitsyn biographer, but I'll give it my best stab. My impression of him is not that he hardened his heart, because he had been exiled from the Soviet Union, but then he was welcomed back. By the end of his life, he was not being mistreated by his own country anymore. He was very mistreated previously, locked in the Gulag. But by the end of his life, the Gulag archipelago was being taught in schools across Russia. And Putin embraced him as much as he embraced Putin. For him, I think it was not. It was kind of an inverse of Baldwin. Instead of being mistreated, he was being welcomed back as a hero. He was being flattered. Maybe his temptation was, again, it'd be a better question for his biographer, but it does seem to me, from what I know of him, that the flattery and the adulation maybe was what seduced him into not noticing that there's an analogous evil happening with Putin. And yes, it was early stages. You know, this is before obviously Putin invaded Ukraine. But there were contemporaries of Solzhenitsyn who at the time were raising alarm bells. They're like, this is a KGB guy. Are you kidding me? Like, this is not somebody who's standing up for the liberal democratic values that you supposedly champion. So I wouldn't let him off the hook just because Putin hadn't fully revealed himself. I think he had revealed enough to know that at best, you could have hoped that Putin was never going to do what he ended up doing, but you never could have embraced him as a liberal democratic figure, even in Solzhenitsyn's lifetime. So to me, it was, yeah, it was more like seduction than a hardened heart is what got to him in the end.
Um, so I take it as you're someone who supports the liberal democratic framework, and you find that
Mhm.
both Baldwin and Solzhenitsyn champion a version of it, like in a certain part of their written literary works, while distancing themselves from it sometime after that. Um, Now, this is a question that has been posed in the country that I'm currently staying in, which is Hungary, which is, well, is liberal democratic equals moral in any way, shape, or form? And if you follow the current
Sorry,
government,
can you
moral,
repeat that? Is moral?
moral, yeah,
Mhm.
morally just, basically.
Mhm.
Is the liberal democratic system morally just? And if you hear from the current government, well, the answer is obviously no. So there's a conflict here. And I think they both Solzhenitsyn and Baldwin share their vision that there's something that is morally unjust about the liberal democratic system. So
Mhm.
how would you convince, well, a given representative of this view otherwise?
I'm a big fan of the famous Churchill quote that democracy is the worst possible system except for all the rest. The there's no utopian panacea. Like, liberal democracy is not going to automatically unlock some perfect world, but it's a lot better than all the alternatives. I think that um, a, a good way to show how desirable liberal democracy is the lengths to which other countries that don't want to be liberal democratic countries have to go to suppress it. So, we have the protests in Iran right now. I personally know Hungarian dissidents who are very distressed by what's happening there right now. And you have to crack down with some serious authoritarian measures to try to stamp out this urge for the kind of equality and freedom that liberal democracy promises to people. Hong Kong's another example. The examples are pretty endless. I think that there's part of human nature that wants to assert itself, to live a full, meaningful life in a way that this kind of liberal democratic freedom offers us, where you have your freedom of conscience, you can express your beliefs without fear of reprisals, you can live your life as long as you're not harming other people as you see fit. There's a strong urge for this. And I think that this is something that has, since its first inception in the Enlightenment era, has taken hold of humanity, and it's something that people crave. And that's not to say, of course, there's this other part of our heart, this tension inside of us, that we want to dominate other people. We want to impose what we think is true and how other people ought to live their lives on them. We want to consolidate power. There's a big temptation for that too. So it's a struggle. I think most people have this intention inside of them. I'm optimistic that the liberal democratic side can win out. But, like, free speech as a kind of liberal democratic value offers a good example of this, where everyone's in favor of free speech until it's speech they don't like. And of course, the whole point of free speech is you have to defend the really nasty stuff that you don't like if you're actually in favor of it. We see precious few people maintain that value once it gets hard, once other people start to say things that they find so reprehensible that they want to clamp down on them so strongly. The urge, the moral disgust is so powerful that people betray this abstract value of freedom of conscience and free speech. So it's a tension within humanity. Um, and it's one that I worry is always going to play out in a kind of cyclical way. I'm a big fan of Francis Fukuyama, and I've taken to heart his idea about the last man at the end of history who gets bored with liberal democracy. And once the drama and the sense of meaning that comes from fighting a good fight, and once the problems are solved and we have a more or less prosperous society where we still have our problems, but there's incremental solutions, it's less invigorating, then people crave something that seems to give their life more meaning, and then we restart history. So I think that is a huge risk with liberal democracy, is people getting bored, people not appreciating how much worse things can be. So again, it's a worst possible system except for all the rest. It does have its risks and its downsides. Other ones that come to mind is people grow concerned about increased atomization and alienation, and the way that liberal democracy goes hand in hand with scientific and technological process and modernity. All of these things came out of the Enlightenment together, and they're interrelated. And people have discomfort with a lot of them. That's not entirely unjustified. It's, we've evolved for millennia to be this tight-knit social species, and now we're being atomized. So this is going against a big part of what we are as a species. There's problems that I worry that may be intractable. It used to be that we had terra incognita in the world. We had parts of the world that were unmapped. We had frontiers. And part of America's success was that we had this great frontier. People could spread out. And of course, the frontier has been very romanticized, and I'm cautious of that. But I think there is something to the idea that there's this promise in liberal democracy of freedom, but you can't be free if you can't opt out. So kind of like an abusive relationship. If you can't leave, you're just stuck in it. Like, well, maybe America's got the best social contract around, but if you're not satisfied with it, it used to be that there's a frontier, you can get a little bit of space from people. And that's just not the case anymore. You can't opt out of one social contract without joining another. So the globe is the same size, but human society is a smaller world. We're much more interconnected now, and there's nowhere to go to escape each other. So I think that this process that Fukuyama talks about of restarting history is a bigger risk, because we have to live with each other in these social contracts that no one literally signed a contract for. No one actually signed up for any of this. We're just born into it. And I think that's very frustrating to people. It's like, how can you tell me that liberal democracy offers me this promise of freedom if I'm not free to leave? If I'm not free to say, this isn't for me. And I want to, it's the frontier is this harsh, violent place. If you leave society and you go off into the wilderness, it's not an easy path. You're probably going to die violently. Like, it's a harsh environment, but at least it's your choice. And that kind of ability to opt out, I think, which had been more or less available within certainly a large number of constraints throughout all of human history until relatively recently, is gone. I love the idea of trying to venture off into the stars, but that's not a very hospitable frontier. That's more like Siberia than it is the American West in terms of a hospitable environment. And the Siberian frontier didn't do much for liberal democracy in Russia. So I'm not quite sure what the solution is. Again, we're in this kind of smaller world. We're really stuck with each other. And I think that because there's no release valve where we can say, okay, I opt out, I'm going to go form a different social contract. I'm just going to go strike out on my own. There is a compromise, like the liberal democratic promise is compromised by you're kind of stuck in what's analogous to an abusive relationship. You can't leave. You're not allowed a divorce out of this marriage unless you want to join another one that could be worse. So there's problems. I wouldn't want to sugarcoat it. But because it is the best possible system, given the other ones are so much worse, it's worth fighting for. And if we are fated to be in these horrible cycles, then I suppose our role to play is to do our best to get to the good part of that cycle again and to stay there as long as possible. I don't really have an optimistic answer so much as to say, rather than feel too bored, people should remember that the good fight is always there for having liberal democratic values. And one role artists can play in that is to maybe give people a reason not to be so bored, to summon beauty into the world that's going to get us so engaged with what's interesting about that, because it's not offering easy answers that we can just close the book on and move on, that we can continue puzzling over for a long time, to alleviate the boredom. So there's things we can attempt to mitigate these problems, even if there's no proper solutions.
So I'd like to end on this note, since you're also a visual artist. How would you illustrate liberal democracy in a black and white pencil art painting or picture?
Um, as a concept, you have to pick out different parts of it. I'm not sure if there's like a proper illustration. You can find an allegory if you want. But that's a tricky question. Like one of the nice things about visual art and trying not to straight up tell people what to think is, and you can contrast this with kind of like social realism murals that were really popular, where you have like all these different characters. It is very allegorical, telling some kind of human history story. Um, to me, that's a little less interesting. I think what I would maybe want to come up with, I would have to, you know, think hard about how to answer that. Would be something that's a little more up for interpretation. Maybe somebody who looks at it wouldn't see it the way I do, or they wouldn't. And because that's what I'm interested in visual art, I would be okay with that. In the essays that I've written, where I've tried to kind of capture parts of that when I am writing about things like liberal democracy. I will use symbolism. Like, this essay we were talking about is one example. This tension in the human heart is part of the problem that liberal democracy is out to deal with. I wrote a piece about America more concretely and our culture wars, and I did something a bit more literal there, thinking about the fabric of our society. And I had and it also had the essay had to do with the role that kitschy Americana plays, that like wearing the flag on the 4th of July. How at one point in America that was seen as very distasteful, and that changed. So because the essay was getting a bit into that history, having this knitted sweater where, because my drawings are very realistic, you get to see in detail the threads. So it worked as like the fabric of society, very literally illustrating that metaphor. And I hoped it wasn't too cheesy to use that metaphor, because again, the essay was getting a little bit into the history of why we as Americans wear these kinds of clothes, at least on the 4th of July. So there's a piece that I have some sketches for that I haven't actually finished. I've made these sketches quite a few years ago. I should pick this project back up, about this story about Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln that I've always found is really touching, where they were friends, but Lincoln did disappoint Douglass in some ways. There was this one instance where Douglass was visiting him at the White House, and he was apprehended by I might be misremembering the details of this, but whichever version of White House security they had at the time, like, oh, whoa, who's this black man coming in to the White House? And somebody who recognized Douglass, knew who he was, intervened and sent a message to Lincoln, and Lincoln was like, no, 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 he's welcome to come here. So you have this friendship between these two giants of the Civil War era, of the effort to end slavery in the U.S. And something I really admire about Douglass is he was, as far as I can tell, very forgiving of the shortcomings that Lincoln had and of American society. All right, so we had a technical glitch, but I was just rambling about how there's this really, to me, touching story about Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, where Douglass was nearly thrown out of the White House. But he was always very forgiving of, as far as I can tell, of these terrible things that were happening to him, and the horribly racist time of the Civil War. And so I had this idea about the difference between being friends versus allies. Often in American politics, there's, especially, circa more like 2020 or like the 2010s, being an ally was something people were talking a lot about. It was a big political buzzword. So, and you have to be a good ally for all the political causes that your identity group doesn't naturally slot you into. So you have your identity group, and then you're an ally to the other progressive causes. And I, in that time, was thinking a lot about how friendship is a much more powerful force than being an ally. An ally is circumstantial. It is a much more tenuous relationship, whereas friendship can really deepen the bonds between people from different identity groups in a way that I think is much more useful and poignant. So I will someday finish this piece, and it'll have a drawing showing this moment of Douglas nearly getting thrown out of the White House and discussing his relationship with Lincoln, and how this kind of friendship is so valuable to help fulfill the promises that America made that we don't always live up to. So that's the kind of thing. Like I like to take little historical anecdotes or a myth or like a snapshot from a novel that I love and bring it to life in my drawings, and then use it to start to tease out some of these ideas. So that would maybe be the next piece I would think of, is like, how am I going to try to illustrate the value of liberal democracy? I would focus on this great friendship.
I see. Yeah, I think that's a great virtue that the liberal democratic framework has. It allows for friendships between like people of different stripes.
Indeed.
Okay. On that note, thank you very much, Megan Gafford, for joining the program.
Thank you for having me.